Is an autism self-diagnosis valid? This is a really nuanced question with a lot of different opinions, a lot of different beliefs, and a lot of different answers, all of which I think are valid, all of which I think have good points to them. And so I just wanted to share my perspective on this. I have a very nuanced take on this topic, like I just said, because there are so many different aspects to a self-diagnosis. I want to start by sharing my own personal experience with self-diagnosis. So in a previous video where I talked about receiving an autism diagnosis as an adult, I also shared that it took me pretty much a year. It took me 10 months from the time I made my appointment to be assessed for autism all the way up to my appointment, because in my area there are only like 2 doctors who diagnose autism in adults. And in that time period of where I suspected I could be on the spectrum to where I was actually being assessed by a professional, it was like a liminal feeling where I felt like completely out of control in my life. I knew that I had some big realizations that honestly helped me understand myself better. And at the same time, I still had a lot of self-doubt and a lot of confusion and just waiting to learn something, or waiting to possibly learn something that will change everything you know about your life for 10 months was really, really, really hard for me. And in that period of when I suspected I could be autistic to when I actually was assessed by a neuropsychologist for autism, I would say that I did have to self-diagnose for my own well-being in order for me to at least start this journey of understanding myself better, to at least start getting the answers that I needed. And also, when I made that decision to self-diagnose, it wasn't an overnight decision. In fact, it took me, I'd say, quite a few months of looking at so many different things. I think, of course, I started by the pretty much doing every single online tool I could to online quiz and different online tools that I could to see if I could possibly be on the autism spectrum. And every single one that I did said that there was a very likely chance that I was. I started looking at YouTube and started reading a lot of articles about the experiences that people on the spectrum were sharing about what it was like being autistic. What are some things that they struggled with? What are some things that they discovered about the way their brains work and things like that? I watched like a ton of those videos, a ton of them, and every single one I could relate to. And then I got to the point where I was like, okay, it's looking like there's a high chance that I am on the autism spectrum, so let's go ahead and look at the diagnostic criteria. So I looked at the diagnostic criteria in the DSM. I met the diagnostic criteria. And then even then, I still had a lot of self-doubt. I still had a lot of imposter syndrome. And me, I think part of my autism is a black and white style, rigid type of thinking where I didn't feel comfortable self-diagnosing yet, because there was still that question in the back of my mind, like, you know, what if I'm making this all up? this isn't a proper diagnosis, so it could be something else. Oh, and speaking of which, I also looked at the diagnostic criteria in the DSM for all the other conditions that could be mistaken as autism. I looked at some different personality disorders. I looked at like OCD. I looked at just a lot of other things that share similarities with autism, and I didn't meet that diagnostic criteria. So everything was pointing towards that I could quite possibly be on the autism spectrum. And this was over a, like, at least a 3-month span. Honestly, it was probably a lot longer of this journey of diving into what even is autism and could I be autistic. So I did a ton of research. This, like, was all I could focus on, all I could think of for however long this process went. Like I said, at least 3 months. I'd say it was probably longer. And it was that point where I decided that I should be assessed for autism, and then it was going to be a 3-month waiting period, and I needed to know, and I needed to at least find ways to accommodate myself for the time being, because the way that I had lived my life up to that point just simply wasn't working for me anymore. I was burnt out, so exhausted, so confused, and I shared a lot about that in my video that I'll actually link in the description, where I talk about the process of being diagnosed with autism as an adult. So I had to self-diagnose, but it wasn't just based off of one TikTok video. It wasn't based off of one online quiz. It wasn't based off just one thing. It wasn't based off a few things. It wasn't even based off like 10 or 15 things. It was based off of a ton of research that I did, and a ton of evidence that I gathered, and a ton of self-discovery that helped me realize that I'd say there's probably like a 90% chance that I am on the autism spectrum, with the other 10% me just needing that external validation from someone who knows what they're talking about and someone who knows what to look for. So with that said, I went into my autism assessment still feeling that doubt that, you know, maybe it is something else. Again, maybe I am making all of this up, which I knew I wasn't, but I think that it's just me and that black and white thinking of I need to have it written down on paper for me to actually know that it's true. And through that month-long process of being assessed for autism, I had the self-doubt was so loud. And after each appointment, I was like, I don't know what she's looking for. I don't know what this is all about. I don't know what she's looking for in this test or that test. And it was just a really confusing process. And it was also a really exhausting process. It brought up a lot of past, and I would describe them as traumatic experiences to the surface in relation to my autism, where she had to ask me about how I was as a child and how I was growing up. It was just exhausting for my brain because it also included an IQ test, and that is an exhausting process to go through. It was also exhausting because it was an unfamiliar environment. Having to be so vulnerable with this person that I just met was also exhausting. And then just the emotional toll of having to wait 1 month, because that's how long my series of 4 different appointments spanned over before I got the final answer that Indeed, I am actually on the autism spectrum. So with all of that said, and from my own personal experience, I believe that a, a self-diagnosis of autism can be valid. And I think that it's unique to every person's situation and every scenario. I will also add that I am truly blessed and grateful to have health insurance. With health insurance, my diagnosis, or my assessment, I mean, cost me about, I think it was like $500. Without insurance, it would have been over $2,000. And just thinking about, how many people don't have that sort of money saved up for something like this, it's a lot of people. And also in the neurodivergent space, a lot of us might not be able to work, or might not have the means to afford something like that. And so I completely understand my own personal privilege in being able to be assessed by a professional for autism. And I also understand that not everyone has access to that, no matter how hard they try. And I think that's another point to bring up, is just the insane cost of healthcare in this country, and especially mental health care. And so I completely understand that as well. Another thing to add, which adds some other points to this conversation, is autism presents differently in females. And I think hopefully more professionals in the autism space, and professionals who can diagnose autism, are understanding this and learning more about this. But I think that some people's autism might present differently than the way that it has been discussed pretty much up until the past few years. Unfortunately, I think some professionals in the space still think of autism as a white boy who likes trains and who lines things up. And what we're learning now is that while that is autism, that's one person on the autism spectrum, and it doesn't cover the vast majority of us on the autism spectrum who has autism that presents in different ways. And I will also add that I have coped with my autism by masking my autism throughout my whole life. And so I brought this up with my neuropsychologist, and she told me that she's able to see through the mask based on the different tests that she used, and the different theories that she used to come to her conclusion. And so that did make me feel a little bit better. But I think that there most likely are still some professionals in the space who only look at autism for how you present yourself right then and there, as opposed to what's actually going on internally, what's going on underneath the surface. So those are just like some points that I have to add to the my belief that autism self-diagnosis can be valid based on the scenario and based on each person's unique situation. And I can also see how some people might have different beliefs than me. I can see how it might be harmful to autistic people, for people to just watch one or two TikTok videos. I hear that brought up a lot. Everyone is self-diagnosing from TikTok. And I can see how it might be a little bit harmful for someone to watch one or two TikTok videos and say that they are autistic, when it could be something completely different. And I think that in an ideal world, we wouldn't even have to have this conversation about self-diagnosis, because autism would be understood better. Everyone would have access to a way to be assessed for autism if they felt that they needed it. The assessor would understand how autism presents in all types of people. It wouldn't cost someone's life savings to be assessed for autism, and the process wouldn't be super exhausting and super traumatizing. Unfortunately, that's not the reality right now, and so with all of that said, I stand by my belief that I think that receiving an autism diagnosis can be seen as a privilege, and I think that it is valid in some scenarios to self-diagnose for autism. It is also unfortunate that I don't know how to word this, but I do feel like it is unfortunate that some people might see one or two videos and like just say that they are autistic when they actually aren't, and then it just, I feel like it kind of takes away the meaning of autism in a way. And I don't want to sound like I'm gatekeeping, because I'm not, but I can definitely see, because some people do make that argument, and I can definitely see how that can be problematic. But also, and this is my own experience, but I feel like for the most part, people who are self-diagnosing aren't just doing it off of a few videos. They're doing it like how I did before I was seen by a professional, where they spent months diving deep into autism and how they can relate to all of those things. They look at the diagnostic criteria. They look at different autistic people and how they would describe their experiences. They look at all the different autistic traits and how they can relate to those things. And it's not a decision that I think most people take lightly. And I think that we need to remember that, especially if we are firmly against self-diagnosis. And so why even self-diagnose? What's the point, right? With a self-diagnosis, it's not something that you can do, or it's not something that you can use for like work accommodations. However, with a self-diagnosis of autism, or a diagnosis of autism, if that's available to someone, we're able to learn so much more about ourselves in ways that we probably didn't even know were possible before we even discovered autism. We're able to not just understand ourselves better, but accommodate ourselves. Like I said, I was at a point in my life where I was burnt out. And by discovering that it could be on the autism spectrum, it helped open up this box of all these different tools and all these different resources, and a sense of community and a sense of purpose, so that I can help myself better, so that I can find ways to get out of this burnout and not just try to survive in life, but get on the path to being able to thrive in life. And I think that it's important that we put our own beliefs and our own notions aside. And I think that we need to trust in each individual person and their own unique experience for them to make the best decision for themselves. Like I said, this is a very nuanced topic, and I'm sure there's different points to bring up that I didn't even bring up. And if there's something you'd like to share, as long as it's kind, as long as it's compassionate, I'd love to hear it in the comments below. I'm open to hearing all sorts of opinions on this. I would say, if I had to describe my opinion on this, that yes, autism self-diagnosis is valid for certain situations and certain scenarios. And again, I can at least do my best to try to see all aspects of this. And so I would love to hear your thoughts on this, your opinions on this, as long as it's coming from a place of love, coming from a place of inclusivity, as long as it's coming from a place of compassion. I think that all these points are valid and all these points need to be heard. So let me know in the comments below.